Well, good morning, everyone. You may notice that I asked the folks to change the setting of the screen because that automatically was a lot of cognitive load for a lot of us. So I hope this is a little bit better. This is better for me. Okay, so I put together a bit of a talk. So I'm going to read it out as well as try to make eye contact, but that doesn't really matter anyway because I can't see so many faces. But this is a really big room, so thank you. But before I begin, can I get a quick shout out for the EdTech workshop organizers? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, now pay attention. All right. Okay, so 16 years ago, I came to this beautiful and this vibrant city, to Toronto, thanks for the land acknowledgement statement, as an international student. I decided to leave my home in New Delhi, where my family lived, where I had many friends and a big social support system. But in 2007, I moved to Toronto with 2 suitcases and some bags full of lentils that my mother had packed because she thought I wouldn't find any mung dal here. True story. It burst open at the airport. But like many aspiring students, I came here to continue my post-secondary education at the University of Toronto. And there was a lot going on through my mind when I first came. I was excited, but I was really nervous. Actually, I was really, really scared. I didn't realize it back then, but I now know that it was actually a very courageous thing to do, to leave the comfort of my home and move to a brand new country with some, or at sometimes no friends at all, in pursuit of something that you don't even know what it might be like, what does it look like. And you had very little idea what the path is going to be like. And not to mention the first winter here, and I just came up with the other additional sentence here, the TTC delays and the construction-related delays, which is why I'm on time, but I hope to come earlier. But despite all that, I made the journey and landed in Toronto. After the initial craziness, I was ready to go to school, my first ever class at the University of Toronto. I have always been interested in how people learn languages, so I enrolled in one of the courses called psycholinguistics. Sounds cool, right? But truth be told, my now husband, but boyfriend back then, discouraged me from taking this course because he knew it would be hard for me, and I also learned the term bird courses from him at the time. I did not know that. But I was all about serious learning. Why? Because I wanted to get into a master's program at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. So I enrolled in the course on Rosie, the former version of Acorn, and I was ready to attend my first ever lecture at U of T. After getting lost multiple times on St. George campus, mind you, this was a bit pre-Google Maps times, and making sense of the terms like northeast corner, southwest, I finally made it to class. But I realized very, very quickly that I wasn't just lost outside. I actually felt very, very lost inside the classroom. It felt like I just couldn't understand anything at all, despite my decent English skills. I remember struggling a lot that first term, not just in my psycholinguistics course, but in all my courses. And a few weeks later, I wrote my first test, and I got a C. I did. Probably my first. I knew that this was not the grade I was going for. I wanted to do better. I knew I could do better. But how when I felt so lost and confused all the time in class? Now we can debate whether it was the right kind of assessment to evaluate my learning or not, but that wasn't really the point at the time. In my heart of hearts, I knew that I actually could not grasp the concepts being taught in any of the courses. I knew that I did not learn what was being taught. It's often easy to blame yourself, and that's what I did. And even outside the class, things weren't that easy. There were financial challenges, I felt lonely, I was homesick, I also got sick around that time. And the lower grade added to my many worries and concerns because how could I get into my desired program at OISE with a bad GPA? The stress and the load I felt was real. I, like many students, carried with me an invisible load that heavily impacted my learning. My teachers couldn't see it at times, most of the times, but it existed, and it really was real. Why am I sharing my story? I'm sharing my story because I want to direct us all to this idea of load that all our students carry with themselves. My challenges were associated with being an international student. That ultimately resulted in learning loss for me during that first year at U of T. It was demotivating too. Other students may have different reasons affecting their learning, meaning they all have some sort of invisible load that they bring to school. All this is to say that our students often feel overloaded by many things happening inside and outside their classrooms. But in all this, if we, as educators, can do anything to take a bit of that load off, I think that can make a huge difference in shaping the learning experience of our students. Now, the truth is, we might not be able to change many of the external factors, financial issues, emotional issues. We can listen, we can support. But the one area where we can have a significant impact is how we design instruction so that our students don't feel lost and overloaded, be it face-to-face learning or online learning. Yes, I am talking about cognitive load. To understand all this, it helps to have some basic knowledge of the science of learning and how learning happens. And to better understand, I want to briefly talk about memory and how it works. Now, some of you might already know all this, but stay with me. It's great that you know it. Just recap, never hurt anyone. This is the part where I'm going to share some key terms and foundational theories. Lucky for you, I do try to pay close attention to cognitive load, so I'll try my best to not overload you. Let's briefly look at some of the terms and how our memory actually works. First, the information comes from the external sources and enters into our, what we call our working memory, where it is processed. Now, where does this information go from there? Well, it comes this way into the black hole. It almost often gets forgotten, which happens all too often, or if the information is lucky enough to pass through the bottleneck, it gets organized and integrated into our long-term memory, which serves as a bit more permanent memory store. It's through actions like rehearsals, self-testing, self-explanation, etc., that the information is transferred from our working memory to long-term memory. So there's that linkage happening. In other words, how people think about the information, what they associate it with, and generally the work they do with the information is what allows it to transfer to long-term memory. And there's a definition of learning. It says learning is when there is a change in long-term memory. And that's what we're trying to achieve, especially in an academic environment. We're trying to achieve learning so long-term memory change occurs and students remember things longer. Still with me? Yeah? Oh, good, perfect. So I want to talk a bit more now about working memory, because it's a crucial link between new incoming knowledge, new is the key word, and our long-term memory. It's believed that our working memory can generally hold between 4 to 7 items or chunks of information, of new information at any time. The number of chunks it can hold is a bit controversial, and I'm in an academic setting in front of experts, so I'm just going to go with the range 4 to 7, so it's all good. Now, the thing is that our working memory is extremely limited in both time and capacity. So only a limited amount of information can stay in there for a limited amount of time, and it goes away after that if nothing happens to it, if nothing's done to it. And this has direct implications on instruction, and in turn the learning process, because one of the key goals of instruction is to introduce new knowledge to students, right? That's why we go to courses. That's why I joined psycholinguistics. We have evidence that strongly suggests that when we design instruction with limitation of working memory in mind, it can lead to effective learning. Now, I want you to think back to the younger me that got lost both inside and outside the classroom from 2007, coming to class hoping to learn new knowledge with an already overloaded working memory. Remember that invisible load I talked about? Now think about all your students and their loads that you cannot see. So when we teach, we are essentially competing for a very important yet temporary real estate that is already so overloaded and volatile. I really hope it's not as bad as the Toronto real estate. Anyway, this takes me to cognitive load theory. Sounds a bit daunting when we use the word theory, but it's actually very pragmatic and fundamental to understand how learning happens. John Sweller developed cognitive load theory in the 1980s as an instructional design theory based on several uncontroversial aspects of human cognitive architecture, one of which is the working memory being a bottleneck. According to the theory, when our working memory is bombarded with too much information, the cognitive load on our working memory increases, leading to cognitive overload. This in turn impairs or impedes learning. So what's the alternative? It's actually quite simple. Let's not overload the students with too much information all at once when we teach. Pretty straightforward, right? But it does help to know when, where, and how we can avoid this cognitive overload on our students. Because when we know the content so well as educators, we forget sometimes that our students don't. And there is this notion of blindness that experts can get sometimes. So now to understand that, it would be useful to look at the three categories or the sources of cognitive load that impact our working memory. The first one is intrinsic cognitive load. Well, this actually comes from the innate difficulty, the actual difficulty that exists within the task or the information being learned or processed. Also note, intrinsic cognitive load can decrease or increase based on what you as a learner or your students as learners already know. That's their prior knowledge. So prior knowledge plays a big role in intrinsic cognitive load. That's why novice learners would experience a higher intrinsic load, whereas one with more background knowledge, or perhaps an expert, would experience a lower intrinsic load doing the exact same task. Here's an example. Right? So, 4x equals 24. Try solving for x in your mind. If you know the answer, which you should, think what all you needed to know to be able to solve a relatively simple equation like this. But if this concept is relatively new to you, one needs to explain to you, right? Like, we are multiplying 4 with a number, we're calling it x, to get 24. What could x be? It, of course, would help if you know your times table, but if you don't, then that adds another element that needs to be learned first. Hence, a higher intrinsic cognitive load on your working memory, so you're too busy figuring it out. Meanwhile, the one person who knows it has already solved for it. So the equation 4x equals 24, 4x equals 24, would have high intrinsic load on a novice math student, but it would be low for someone well-versed with it. And they quickly answer that x equals 6. I hope you got that right. Good. Awesome. Jokes apart. But one way to lower the load for the learner is to design instruction in a way that takes care of the original source of intrinsic cognitive load. In other words, it's important that we're aware of this form of cognitive load while designing instruction. And one way to lower intrinsic cognitive load would be to simplify or organize the new information in meaningful chunks, while also making sure that you're taking the time to fill in the gaps in your students, in learners' pre-existing knowledge about that topic. Okay, so much so for intrinsic cognitive load. Extraneous cognitive load. This is the additional load imposed by poorly designed instructional materials. So any unnecessary details like, I want you to read it and understand it and tell me what you read on it. Got it? I'm kidding. That's not possible. So any unnecessary details included in the instructional material like funny memes, but it was pretty, colorful, or background music, I got that, or poor fonts, unclear speech, flashy or useless animations that engages a learner's working memory and takes away their focus on actual learning content belongs to the extraneous load. The good news is, this is actually a lot easier to deal with. A rule of thumb, less is more, simple is better, and be as clear as possible. And luckily, we have evidence-informed multimedia principles I sadly can't cover that in this keynote because that's a keynote in itself, but look it up, multimedia principles. You probably already know about it, some of you, that help us design instruction that can actually lower extraneous load. One way to think about lowering the extraneous load is to ask yourself, would this additional feature or prop directly support my students' learning? If not, then it is highly likely what they call it a seductive detail that will increase the extraneous load on your learners. I say skip it. The third cognitive load, germane cognitive load. This is the mental capacity that is directed towards integrating the new information with existing knowledge. That's the magic. That's where the magic happens. This is the kind of load we want learners to take. One way to think about the germane load is when the learners are going, oh, I get it, 4x, 4 times multiplied, x equals 6. That's when they're linking the new knowledge with past knowledge they already possess. One thing to note here is that when the brain is already overloaded with intrinsic and extraneous cognitive load, there is no space remaining for germane cognitive load. Sorry, that's the connection. That's the visual. That is why it is crucial when designing instruction to keep intrinsic and extraneous cognitive load as low as possible, so there is room in that container, in that brain of ours, in the working memory, the limited working memory of ours, for the germane load to do its magic, which is processing and integrating the new incoming information with the already existing information in our long-term memory. I may have cognitively overloaded you. Sorry about that. That's why I have a recap slide for you. Please take a moment to read it while I just take a sip of water. And when you're done, give me a thumbs up emoji. I mean, a real thumbs up. So. Because it's already there, I don't need to read it. I'm getting some thumbs up. Oh yeah, I love that. Thank you. All right. So recap always helps, right? Now, why does it matter that we pay attention to all this as instructors? Because all too often the hard work of teaching gets lost because it doesn't get past the working memory of our students. We pay a lot of attention to the content, which no doubt is important, but we forget about the load that it can impose on our learners. Hence, paying attention to how learning actually happens can really support our learners and in turn you. I mean, you can use those office hours to drink coffee or secretly binge watch your favorite Netflix show. But there is also robust evidence-based suggesting that instructional techniques are most effective when they are designed to accord with how the human brain learns and uses knowledge. And considering the limitation of working memory and the susceptibility it has towards cognitive overload, it is an essential point, which is perhaps why in 2017, my apologies, Dylan William, an influential educationalist and an advocate for formative assessment, took to Twitter in 2017 to write this. I'll let you all read it again. It's a short sentence. Now, Sweller's cognitive load theory actually is a lot more than what I just covered, but this is the very basis of it. And if I managed to somewhat inspire you all to consider the visible and the invisible load that our students experience, and to take meaningful steps to reduce the cognitive load on our students, then I'd consider this keynote a success. And it also aligns well with the theme of this year's EdTech workshop, which I'm sure the organizers are very happy about. So I invite you to take the shortcut Control-Shift and go back to the fundamentals. Take the load off as you continue designing instruction. Now, it may seem like I'm done, but I'm not. There's one more thing. Well, I was hoping you'll start clapping and all, but it's okay. It's fine. Pause was good, right? But you laughed. So I'll just take a few more moments to connect all this to educational technology, because that's why we all came here. I think learning and educational technology now go hand in hand. I really, truly believe that it's not a nicety anymore, but a necessity. It doesn't matter if we're teaching in person or online. We are regularly using tools like Quarkus, Pepper, Peer Scholar, the entire suite of tools on Google and Microsoft, Canva, and so much more to help our learners meet their learning objectives. Our challenge today is not so much if we have access to a specific tool for a specific task, because someone somewhere has already made it or developed it or is making it right now. But the challenge now is, which one do I choose and why? What makes it the right choice of tool for me? And I say that the answer lies in the science of learning, because the instructional design principles that make instruction and learning effective are extremely transferable. Meaning the principles that make instruction and learning effective are the same that can guide us as we navigate our path of designing instruction using educational technology tools. So once again, knowing about the cognitive load theory and how to decrease the load can come in handy as you choose your next instructional approach to create some magic. I'll share an example. For my doctoral research, I developed an instructional model called Midweek Microlesson for a graduate level online course. I developed a range of microlessons using a variety of educational technology tools. The microlessons served various instructional purposes. For example, clarification of tricky concepts, repeat and reinforce, and sometimes they aimed at enriching and augmenting students' understanding of the weekly concepts in a fun and non-overwhelming way. In many ways, the microlessons were also integrated to lower the intrinsic cognitive load that was coming from the key concepts of the course. Each time I designed a microlesson, I paid close attention to the principles from the science of learning. It helped me make decisions like, do I work with a video here, or an infographic will do the trick? Things like that. This also informed which tool or platform I was going to use. I frequently asked myself questions like, how easy or difficult is it for my students to access the microlesson? Do they need to create an account on this platform and then they sign in and they do this, or can they simply click on a URL and just go to the course, because all that increases the extraneous load on them? Does the tool allow for scaffolding? Will the students need to spend too much time learning this new platform, or they actually can focus on the content, which is the key here? Does the tool have many distractions leading to extraneous cognitive load? And many more questions. So here's an example of one of the microlessons that I created. Actually, there's a real QR code, it works. It's a microlesson I created on a platform, and it's called Is Multitasking Real? And the beautiful thing was that they could just click on the link and just watch it, or use a QR code, or it could embed it. There was no multiple layers to go through that process. These are simple questions that I shared before, but their answers can have a strong impact on how I make my instructional choices. All this is to say that having some knowledge of foundational theories of instruction can really guide us in making sound decisions when it comes to choosing EdTech tools. Here's another really quick example. Some folks are probably already familiar with that. This series of microlearning videos that I developed for Peer Scholar, the videos are essentially aimed at reducing intrinsic cognitive load by informing students of the challenges involved in complicated tasks, like giving feedback, really challenging, or working in teams, really challenging, and then providing clarity with respect to how to do the task well. This allows students to really understand the task and likely frees up space for more germane load, the good kind of load that we want them to do processing with, as they actually do the task. Now, there's no doubt in my mind that you're an expert in your field, and you are passionate about what you teach. You are already creating magic in your classes. But how amazing would it be if we can make this magic even more magical by doing something that's really within our reach, and that can have huge positive implications on learning and long-term retention for our students. Let's pay more attention to what creates the cognitive load on our very essential but limited working memory. And let's continue to explore and learn ways to reduce this load for our learners. Throughout this talk, I've discussed cognitive load in academic terms, highlighting how a consideration of load when designing learning experiences can be helpful to students. As I end this talk, really, I'm about to end it. As I end this talk, I'd like to unpack the helpful just a little. When not overloaded, a student is able to perform at their best and is most likely to experience success when learning, which itself motivates future learning. When overloaded, on the other hand, a student may fail to do their best, not because they're incapable of more, but because they simply do not have the bandwidth to meet the challenge of the task. We know a core predictor of student success within a class is the presence of the instructor. Are they there? Do they care? Managing load helps students succeed, and designing learning in such a way as to optimize student success is perhaps the most caring thing instructors can do for students. In the end, it's all about seeing our students as fellow humans on a life journey, just like all of us, just like the younger me who came to Toronto those years ago, and doing what we can to make their journey a journey of success. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sachdeva.
Thank you.
We have time for perhaps one or two very quick questions.
Oh.
So I'm just interested in your main cognitive load. You kind of said that it goes back to previous learning. How does cognitive load deal with transferability to like future?
Can you elaborate a little bit on that? What are you trying to say?
When we try, a lot of skills I try to teach are transferable. I do first year course. The first year course try to enable learning in a number of years. How should we think about cognitive load in terms of making learning transferable forward looking?
Well, if I'm understanding the question correctly, so forward learning, future learning is what we're about to learn, right? So I think one of the things we can do is to make sure what you're about to learn, if you understand what you're about to learn, if you have figured that out, this small sort of simplified version of that, to make sure that the learners have the prerequisite background knowledge. And if they don't have it, so of course the pre-testing can help with that, so ensuring that you have that. And if not, then definitely there's scope for allowing for a little bit more of deep processing before students can actually start learning the new, right? So I think a huge component is making sure that the background knowledge is there before they can start constructing meaning, which is a requirement, let's say, for them to learn the next step. So it's always nice to do a quick review, a quick check. It's actually one of the first principles of explicit instruction is start the class, start with a quick review for future learning, because that gives you an idea what you don't know, what your learners don't know. Then maybe it's a time to pause and actually fill those gaps first, and then prepare them, prime them for a bit more success, and rather than actually overloading their working memory. I'll share a really quick example here. My daughter, she's 8 years old, and she's learning comparing fractions right now, right? And she needs to do this thing called a cross multiplication for it to see which fraction will be bigger. So she's, in her mind, already knows, okay, I'm making the denominator the same, but she needs to know her times table. And if she doesn't, then that's a step back. It's like, okay, you need to do that. Or if it's a 2-digit number, then I have to see, do you know how to multiply the 2-digit numbers? Or so there's a lot of layers of knowledge that she's going to need. So I often ask questions. So this is for my daughter, but I would do that in my class as well. Preparing for the future learning, you want to make sure that your learners have the required relevant background knowledge, domain-specific background knowledge as well.